Japanese anime and manga is growing increasingly prevalent in contemporary mainstream media. It deals with pressing socio-political issues like race and discrimination without sacrificing appeal or accessibility. Following Entman's framing definition, this dissertation examines One Piece, a popular ongoing action-adventure series, to determine how it implicitly frames racism, identifying actors, conduct, causes, and casting moral judgment. In lieu of this series' vast influence and absence of academic interest, this analysis asks, what role massively popular Japanese anime and manga play in tackling social issues? This dissertation argues that One Piece is as implicitly anti-racist as it explicitly presents itself to be. It identifies the state as an antagonistic racist perpetrator and minorities as sympathetic victims. It defines racism as a systemic problem, proliferated by state leadership and their bigotry. It also defines control, criminalization, and censorship as systemically racist behavior. Through this representation of good and evil, it critiques racism and invites the audience to do the same. This dispels any uncertainty surrounding the show's underlying message and paves the way for more studies of these popular yet overlooked mediums. Hello, I'm Finley Skollick, and this is my undergraduate dissertation, More Than Skin Deep, an analysis of implicit racism in Eiichiro Oda's One Piece. As Juro and Pollock have expressed, media culture defines childhood, national identity, history, beauty, truth, and individual agency. The influence of media content possesses great sway over how audiences, particularly youth, understand social reality, regardless of the accuracy. The media also plays an important role in communicating issues. How it represents these can shape perceptions and discourse through framing knowledge, science, responsibility, and policy. These representations take place within larger contexts, including politics, ownership, journalistic norms, and understandings of science. Therefore, framing is related to power dynamics and representational choices.
Despite being relatively understudied compared to traditional media, Japanese anime is a form of media that's global popularity has been steadily growing for decades. Evolving from children's entertainment and a quirky niche that weirdos, nerds, and social outcasts inhabited, anime has become an accepted form of mainstream entertainment that regularly engages with serious historical events, philosophical dilemmas, and culturally diverse aesthetic traditions, as both a medium and an art form. Estimates show that more than a third of the world's population, roughly 2.8 billion people, watch anime, and in 2023, international sales surpassed Japan's own for the first time in history, illustrating the scale of the medium's worldwide appeal. Among the estimated 136,000 plus Japanese titles, there is one which stands head and shoulders above the rest, comparable even in longevity and appeal to Harry Potter. Eiichiro Oda's One Piece is a popular ongoing Japanese manga that has been serializing in Shueisha's Weekly Shonen Jump magazine since 1997, and has been adapted into an anime series by Toei Animation since 1999. The story follows a young pirate named Monkey D. Luffy who searches for a legendary treasure known as the One Piece on a quest for freedom and adventure. To achieve this, he assembles a diverse crew of people, including mammalian non-humans, merfolk, and giants, called the Straw Hat Pirates. Together, they fight against the totalitarian and antagonistic world government, which seeks to maintain dominance of its oppressive world order. The story has become a cultural phenomenon. Its universal appeal has caused it to balloon past its target demographic of young boys, with over 111 volumes, 21 series, 56 video games, 15 movies, 13 TV specials, and a Netflix live-action adaptation. In addition to ranking top 5 in both a 2021 domestic Japanese survey and an international IMDb poll for popular well-known anime, it also holds the record for being the best-selling comic book and manga series of all time. Because people are mostly introduced to media from a young age, scholars have documented the line between reality and fantasy has become blurred. Whilst it is doubtful that anyone would start believing that hordes of privateers are scouring the world for lost pirate treasure, they could obtain a set of moral standpoints and outlooks through representations and depictions of global issues like racism, totalitarianism, media suppression, historical revisionism, and slavery, all of which are present in the story of One Piece. One Piece has always been considered deft and nuanced in representing social issues surrounding race. Certain story arcs like Fishman Island and Sabaody are explicitly centered around themes of racism, discrimination, and slavery. There is one discrepancy which appears to undermine the series' well-received explicit critiques of racism, however. Throughout the course of the anime, fans began noticing that some of the main characters' skin colours were being progressively whitened. I originally wanted to explore the causes and reception to these changes because there isn't any existing research on this. I also thought it might relate to studies of Japan's contemporary skin whitening practices, but then my focus was drawn to how apparently uncharacteristic this was of the series. Oda has made it clear in audience Q&As that the diversity of his characters is something he genuinely respects. Considerations which were honoured by the live-action Netflix adaptation's casting. Against the backdrop of globally growing far-right sentiment, Japan has also experienced a resurgence of racism and ultranationalism. Stemming from a need to justify its imperialist expansion in the late 19th century, the Japanese national identity was manufactured around homogeneity and superiority. Resultingly, despite prohibition by their constitution, Japanese society has long tolerated hate speech and racial animosity towards minorities. This made me wonder if the skin whitening was a sign that One Piece similarly speaks to acceptance and tolerance of diversity, whilst simultaneously proliferating disparaging depictions of race. Motivated by this contradiction's empirical void and the real-life implications it can have on discourse surrounding race, I decided to scrutinise the series' implicit depictions of racism to determine if its critiques are only skin deep. The aim of this dissertation is to examine the logic and manifestation of implicit systemic racism in One Piece in areas which typically receive less critical attention. This is to more comprehensively understand if apparent anti-establishment sentiment translates to anti-racist sentiment. To that end, I constructed the following research questions to guide this dissertation's analysis of the systemic racism within One Piece and its broader implications for audience engagement. Question 1. How does the world government view non-humans, and how does this manifest in their behaviour? Question 2. How and why does the hegemonic governmental authority of Eiichiro Oda's One Piece interact with problematic racial minorities? Question 3. How does the author try to influence the audience's perception of discrimination and systemic racism in his representation of characters, scenes, and story? Through them and Entman's 1993 definition of framing, I examined One Piece's representation and definition of victims and perpetrators of systemic racism, the manifestations of their behaviour, diagnosis of the root causes, and their moral evaluation. This helped me determine that despite the uncertainty caused by its anime adaptation, One Piece is as intrinsically anti-racist implicitly as it explicitly appears to be. Following this introduction, my dissertation includes a literature review broken up into 3 subsets. These are on the broader scholarly bodies of racism in media, anime, and One Piece, to draw on studies with similar focus and identify empirical gaps in existing literature. This is followed by a methodology detailing my use of framing and multimodal critical discourse analysis to examine a vast representative selection of moments from the anime and manga of One Piece. After that, my analysis is broken up into 2 subsections. The first tackles research question 1. It identifies the government as prejudiced against minorities, compelling them to discriminate differently against those they deem desirable and undesirable. The second addresses number 2. It defines how the government systemically persecutes minorities through control, criminalisation, and censorship, driven by their leadership's prejudice. Each contribute to number 3. They show the struggle of the racially oppressed protagonists is framed as good, just, and right, contrasted with the antagonistic racists' portrayals as bad, unjust, and wrong. They are then followed by a conclusion, which summarises my findings. It reflects that they are important because they determine One Piece to be as implicitly anti-racist throughout the whole series as when it explicitly discusses themes of racism. It is also significant because it highlights the ways it conveys this to the audience, contrary to my own expectations. This implicates the skin whitening incident as disconnected from the series' anti-racist critique and opens the door to other neglected popular media being more critically To examine the representation and framing of racism in anime and manga, it's important to consider the wider literature surrounding media and its framing of racism. Because all kinds of mass media serve as mediums to interpret contemporary issues like race and discrimination, how they communicate this discourse can shape public understanding. Byers and Dell describe race as a social construction shaped by media representations. Brooks and Elbath also recognise that in contemporary society, media plays a pivotal role in shaping social identities and perceptions of race in the way media institutions produce and disseminate images, symbols and narratives that influence how individuals understand their social realities. The prominent British sociologist Stuart Hall has notoriously argued that the media is both a potent source of ideas concerning race and a place where they are articulated, worked on, transformed and elaborated. American academic Douglas Kellner would agree that media images help shape our worldview and values, that media stories provide the symbols, myths and resources through which we constitute a common culture, and through the appropriation of which we insert ourselves into this culture. This relationship is reciprocal, as media feeds us an understanding of the world coloured by its depictions of racialization, so too is its voracious appetite fed with racial image and narrative. It has also been documented that representations reflect and distort both self-perceptions and external perceptions. Through their research, many studies have demonstrated that representational tropes and racialized images can morph complex social issues and human identities into one-dimensional colour-coded stereotypes and caricatures by circulation in news media. There are a great many academic works which engage with racism in the specific context of Japan. Beginning with the historical study by Fukurai and Yang, they trace Japan's racism back to the introduction of Western racial ideologies to 19th century Japanese political elites. These state planners manufactured racial ideologies to promote a new nation based on a myth of racial homogeneity and racial superiority over other Asian races. Despite this, the Japanese government has never acknowledged the role of Japanese supremacy racism or in justifying their imperial projects. This is theorized to be a contributing factor to persistent, widespread discrimination of minorities and the resurgence of racist ultra-nationalism. Iwabuchi and Takezawa noted the Japanese media have often stirred fears of the threat of illegal migrants and foreigners, reporting in heavily racialized terms. These vast bodies of study are invaluable examples for examining real-world racist bias. Similar work could and should be done on fiction like One Piece. While news media is the prevalent focus of much research, anime has always been relatively understudied by comparison, despite its mass appeal. Representation in anime plays a crucial role in shaping perceptions and reducing bias. It can also challenge normalized representations, to destabilize the status quo and subvert dominant power structures. Writing directly related to anime first began to appear around 1987, when the Society for Animation Studies was founded by Henry Deneroff, and in 1991 when the Animation Journal was launched by founding editor Maureen Furness. Growing from textual and aesthetic analysis surrounding giant robots and science fiction, the field has seen a diverse array of contributions over the years, from Jonathan Clements' full-length history of Japanese animation to Galbraith et al.'s Debating Otaku in Contemporary Japan, Mark McLeland's The End of Cool Japan, and Japanese Animation in Asia by Marco Pelleteri and Huang Yong. Significant work has been done on anime's philosophy and transnationality, though because some consider it important to understand the historical construction of anime, there is much debate over what that means and who gets to decide it. But while there is a great deal of contention surrounding anime's conception and its classification, this will naturally change as anime develops and transforms too. Of the few studies using multimodal critical discourse analysis on anime and manga, none dealt with racism, though fortunately there have been some textual and discourse analyses on anime through gender, race and ethnicity, representations of South Asians, and a framing analysis on constructing hierarchies of race in anime and manga that I can draw from too. This apparent absence of academic activity identifies it as an area of interest for study. Despite its prominence in Japanese popular culture, academic attention to Eiichiro Oda's creation is notably quite limited. A cursory search in Google Scholar for One Piece by Eiichiro Oda unearths 1,300 results. in contrast to the comparable Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling, which has 34,000 results and 332,000 for Harry Potter alone. It is often overlooked as a serious work due to its mainstream appeal as entertainment. This is a shame considering how avidly One Piece fans engage with the series across online platforms. Outside of a few literary analyses and studies on gender representation in the series, the primary emphasis of academic research on One Piece tends to be on its literary significance in contrast to European or Western counterparts, alongside its portrayal of historical cultures in Asia and Japan, thanks to its prominently Japanese cultural influence. There is, however, one other article with a similar focus to my own, by De Silva Calixto et al. It analyses the Sabaody Archipelago and Fishman Island story arcs of the anime, in line with Cameroonian philosopher Mbembe's discussion of how racism and necropolitics, the use of social and political power to control people's lives, as defined by Foucault, are used by authoritarian governments to maintain power, in addition to how necropolitics are being fought through insurgencies and anti-race struggles through characters. Their interpretation of One Piece is that bodies outside the established standard are strongly discriminated against, and that this allows the audience to reflect on racism against black people, particularly from a historical and contemporary Brazilian standpoint. They discuss the assertion that racism is the key tool for the murderous state that dominates the Sabaody Archipelago, finding human sovereignty to be perpetuating atrocities to the detriment of fishmen. They also hope that forms of entertainment such as comic books and cartoons will be recognised as meaningful narratives that explore important social issues. I believe that my own contribution can further advance the studies surrounding One Piece without being invalidated by the existence of this work for two reasons. Firstly, we are examining different aspects of the same case study. Whilst De Silva Calixto et al. Centre around explicit critiques of racism, I avoid this. By choosing to examine how the series comprehensively frames racism, I can examine moments where it features implicitly. Secondly, audiences interpret texts in various ways, based on their individual knowledge frameworks. Both my background and methodology assure this. My methodology is particularly tailored to uncovering meaningful aspects of apparently meaningless scenes.
By using a multimodal critical discourse analysis and framing analysis guided by Entman's definition, I can therefore extrapolate a unique and constructive viewpoint from this.
This dissertation is positioned in an interpretivist epistemology and a constructivist ontology. Interpretivism grounds itself in the emphasis of how individuals interpret the social world that we live in, and takes the view that the social world cannot be studied using a scientific model. Constructivism follows the concept that social phenomena and the meanings attached to them are continually being created and revised by social actors. Therefore, my research questions consider that the categories people use to understand the world and social phenomena, like race and discrimination, are social products whose meaning is constructed through discourse. This ontology and epistemology lead to the use of qualitative research, as they are inductive and follow these assumptions.
The methodological approach I used was framing analysis. Framing analysis is useful for understanding how media discourse can shape public attitudes on political and social issues, as it argues that frames organise and categorise the human experience. Since this approach excels at uncovering meaningful aspects of seemingly meaningless scenes, it was well suited to my research into the implicit framing of racism in One Piece and how this may influence public understanding. Entman's definition of framing guided my research. He describes it as a way to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation. They define salience as making pieces of information more memorable and meaningful to audiences, as achieved through repetition, placement, or association with culturally familiar symbols. Frames are thus mechanisms through which text can define problems, diagnose causes, make moral judgments, and suggest remedies. This definition of framing is useful for my research as it facilitates exploration of how the text frames racism through how it does or doesn't represent the issue and actors within it, the root causes of systemic racism, evaluate the causal agents, and suggest ways of overcoming them. Due to limitations in scope, I had to avoid analysing One Piece's implicit remedy suggestions through framing analysis, but it remains an area for further research.
This study was carried out inductively, with deductive reasoning in line with existing literature on racism in media. The inductive method views theory as the result of observations and involves theoretically reflecting on the data, whilst the deductive aspect entails further data collection to confirm these theoretical insights. I began by watching the anime's Funimation English dub and reading through the manga's Viz Media English translation once each to make initial observations and identify common frames. After comparing my observations to multiple online fan-made retrospectives and recaps, I reviewed targeted moments of the series again to build upon these observations. I then identified and reviewed multiple scenes from around 30 chapters and episodes, spread across the whole story to provide detailed examples of these frames and their potential impact on public perception. In presenting my findings in this dissertation, I selected the evidence from both the anime and the manga on the basis of whichever illustrated my argument most suitably. Using Entman's framing analysis, I categorized these observations into 4 main themes, breaking some of them down into different components. Definitions of victims and perpetrators, definitions of their behaviour, where this stems from, and portrayal to the audience. I also used multimodal critical discourse analysis. MCDA posits that discourses are influenced by power dynamics and attentively considers the use of various semiotic resources such as language, sound, and images. It combines basic analysis of dialogue with visual choices to see how they represent people and events. This is useful for analysing television and comics because their images are just as important as words. MCDA aids revealing hidden or highlighted content in multimedia texts and their potential socio-political impact. This helps identify what elements of the series' systemic racism are concealed or foregrounded and the effect this may have on public comprehension. One key component of textual analysis is the active audience concept. Audiences interpret texts in various ways based on their own knowledge frameworks. My interpretation of the text might therefore differ from other dominant audience members' interpretations. Nonetheless, as they are influenced by viewers' socio-political backgrounds, no single correct interpretation can exist. Whilst textual analyses and discourse provide in-depth text analysis, they might introduce interpreter bias, as researchers might find what they expect or want to see.
Hence, I acknowledge that my interpretation is one of many, and its validity may be limited by my personal background. As both a fan of One Piece and a student of global development, the intersection of my interests and education led to the conception of this dissertation and will doubtlessly have influenced it. This doesn't make my perspective arbitrary, however. By establishing my analysis within the societal context, discourse, and broader literature by thoroughly analysing the text, I aim to identify a likely dominant reading. This research consequently intends to explore how the series implicitly frames racism and its potential influence on public understanding.
The first chapter of this analysis defines racism as a systemic problem. The central hegemonic authority of One Piece, the world government, as its perpetrator, and non-human racial minorities as its victims. This framing morally evaluates the victims as sympathetic protagonists and the perpetrators as malign antagonists. The second chapter defines the government's systemic acts of racism and diagnoses their root causes, using a minority called the D-Clan as a case study. The series morally judges these acts to be reprehensible and establishes the connection between the state, racism, and evil, confirming how One Piece's authoritarian critique implicitly translates to a critique of racism as well. Additionally, all manga panels referenced here are read right to left in the traditional Japanese format.
This chapter establishes that the agenda of the central hegemonic authority of One Piece, the world government, is maintained through prevailing institutionalized racism against non-humans, such as mammalian humanoids who they view as undesirable and subservient pets, and giants as desirable and valuable soldiers. The world government propagates harmful ideas and negative stereotypes, and relies on deceit and coercion to recruit non-humans into subservient positions throughout the entire story. This demonstrates their active efforts to establish an entrenched racial hierarchy with humans at the top, which can resist even internal change.
In episode 320 of the anime, the Straw Hat Pirates stormed a massive judicial island and stronghold of the world government called Enies Lobby. The world government subsequently issued them wanted posters, assessments of their enemies' perceived threat levels. Measured in berry, the domestic currency of the One Piece world, roughly equal to the Japanese yen, bounties are often used as informal rankings of power, infamy, and success. In chapter 435, Tony Chopper, the Straw Hat's humanoid reindeer doctor, is excited to receive his first bounty, evident from his smiling face and accompanying sparkle effects. This mirrors the enthusiasm of his macho crewmates, who ascribe to this informal measurement of worth as enemies of the world government, despite the protestation from the crew's sensible navigator Nami. This reading is further reinforced on page 15, where Chopper's comical snorts of steam and beads of sweat display his fiery enthusiasm to receive his first bounty, combined with a hint of trepidation. It is then revealed that whilst the other members of the crew received incredibly high bounties, totaling 623 million berries, Chopper is ascribed only 50, for his captured dead or alive, and listed as the crew's pet in Figure 3. It is clear in Figure 4 that Chopper is devastated by this reflection of how others see him. The shock of this revelation hits him hard. The way his soul is drawn leaving his body, mumbling incoherently about his minuscule bounty, invites the audience to find the absurdity of this scene amusing. In lieu of their heroic escapades at Eni's lobby, which should have merited them all high bounties, the comically exaggerated reactions from Chopper and his crewmates serve as a satisfying punchline. However, reflected in Figure 3's joke of a wanted poster is the government's institutionalized racism. Causing them to quantifiably value his life so little, this prevents it from seeing him as a sentient being with agency. This is neither an isolated event nor an unintentional mistake. The two subsequent times when the updated bounties are revealed, Chopper is again listed as a pet with a small bounty, whilst all the other Straw Hats' bounties increased by 50 million berries across the board in episode 746, Chopper's only increased by 50. In the anime's English dub, shipwright Frankie exclaims,
"Ooh, I don't want to be the one to break the news to him."
In the manga, his crewmates express dumbfounded shock and pity for Chopper when they say,
I have no words. The poor guy."
Cementing this as a long-running gag. Although the audience is encouraged to derive mirth from this, it is apparent from his crewmates' reactions that it deeply upsets Chopper, to the point that they don't want to tell him about it. Most recently in episode 1086, Chopper excitedly jumps to catch his bounty, inquiring whether it went up, only to outragedly ask,
"Hey, is this some kind of joke?"
at the 900 berry increase. Dejected, he throws himself to the floor, sobbing and flailing and laments,
"I'm not a pet, I'm a pirate too. Give me a Corey nickname and a real bounty."
Aside from reaffirming the toll this discrimination has on Chopper, Figure 5 highlights the consistency in the world government's behaviour and the strength of their entrenched outlook of non-humans as subhuman. This not only confirms the lack of worth the government places on Chopper's humanoid reindeer life, but it also shows their obstinate belief in a rigid racial hierarchy. In spite of Chopper facing off against many dangerous and skilled foes, not least those parts of the government, they persistently label him as a pet. This classification proves the world government ascribes so little self-determination to Chopper that they don't even believe he could be doing this without a human master to control him. In the story, there are other characters whose circumstances mirror and contrast Chopper's own. Firstly, there's Beppo, a polar bear mink, a race of humanoids with furry mammalian features, who serves as the navigator of the Heart Pirates, a majority human crew. He is also plagued by low bounties, jumping from 500 to 1,500 berries when his cruise was over 200 million. Then there are the Nox Pirates, an entirely mink pirate crew who garnered a bounty of at least 382 million berries for investigating government secrets. The main similarity between Chopper and Beppo is that they are one of, if not the only, non-human members of a human majority crew. The Nox Pirates, however, were an entirely non-human crew with no humans on board. Therefore, when whole crews of non-humans come into conflict with the government, they warrant real bounties. But when non-humans join human crews, the world government perceive them as worthless pets. Evidently, the government perceive the coexistence of humans and non-humans on the same crew to be a relationship of domination and subservience, because their own hierarchical ideology leads them to ascribe worth and impose a falsely held power dynamic upon them. Only when viewed as a cohesive collective can the world government recognise non-humans as sentient beings with autonomy and agency. This explains why the minks of the Nox Pirates were spared from the government's prejudice, but Chopper and Beppo were not. Whilst being painted as a worthless criminal is inherently disparaging, the negative impact doesn't stop there. In One Piece, the world government not only acts as a beneficent protector to many of the world's citizens, but also as their penultimate authority. It's therefore able to greatly influence public opinion. In chapter 598, during the return to Sabaody arc, when a group of pirates impersonate the Straw Hats for clout, despite having already acquired a stray fox as their fake Tony Chopper, the real Chopper is naively fooled by their disguises and tails them, attempting to engage them in conversation. When the charlatans recognise him as the genuine Chopper in Figure 7, they try to deceive and acquire the Straw Hat's pet to make their ruse more convincing. By the imposter's conversation, which refers to Chopper in terms of masters, domestication and pets, it becomes evident that the world government's bigotry has effectively spread through Figure 3's propaganda. Their harmful ideology that regards certain non-humans as subhuman has become ingrained in the wider populace.
Despite the wide range of races and nations within the One Piece world, the only non-humans that join the world government and its armed forces do so under coercion and tethers of subservience. Their positions of authority are also entirely filled with humans. For a demographic representation of the Marines, at the Battle of Marineford at Navy headquarters in Chapter 550, of the 100,000 elite troops assembled, only 9 were non-human, all of whom giants. This is not for lack of trying though. Other races are just so distrustful of the Marines and the government that they never join, except in circumstances of deceit and coercion, as is the case with Vice Admiral John Giant. In Figure 9, we explicitly overhear a secret conversation between the child trafficker Carmel and the government's secret service about how they arranged a little stunt to help her produce the first ever giant recruit for the Navy. Using this trickery and deceit, she was likewise able to procure the 8 members of the giant unit for the world government seen in Figure 8. This is concrete evidence that the government desire to fill their dangerous subservient positions with desirable non-humans, especially ones as strong as giants, and that they are willing to use methods of deceit and coercion to make it happen. The prevalence of this endemic behaviour towards desirable non-humans such as giants is further exemplified by the 2 giant pirates, Oimo and Kashi.
During a conversation with one of the Straw Hats, the 2 giants who barred the protagonist's entry to the world government stronghold and judicial island Enies Lobby revealed that they only did so by coercion. After setting out to sea to look for their bosses one day, they were set upon by Marines and captured. They were then told that their bosses had been caught and imprisoned in a huge government prison. The world government then struck a deal that if they worked for them for 100 years, they would set their bosses free and allow all 4 of them to return home safely. This revelation invites the audience to sympathise with the giants. Even as mighty as they are still made to bow before the oppressive might of the government in their endeavour of noble self-sacrifice. This is amplified when the Straw Hats revealed to the 2 giants that the Navy had tricked them. They had never captured their captains in the first place. Their internal maelstrom of happiness and sorrow is temporarily obscured by venting their anger against 50 years of the Marines' injustice and exploitation in Figure 10, inviting the audience to share their satisfying retribution. This positions the audience to empathise with the giants' victimhood and despise their perpetrators' injustice. This all reinforces the conclusion that the world government view non-human races through a lens of utility, and those which appear useful in positions of subservience, as say soldiers, become targets of deceit and coercion, in effort to be possessed and controlled.
To illustrate that institutional racism extends across multiple government branches past giants to other exceptionally strong non-humans too, look no further than the fishman helmsman of the Straw Hats, Jinbei, former captain of an all-fishman pirate crew called the Sun Pirates. The fishmen are a race of humanoid merfolk with widely varying fish-like features who have historically been discriminated against by humans and the world government.
Themes of slavery and racism are explicitly intertwined with story arcs where they feature prominently, such as the Sabaody Archipelago and Fishman Island. Subsequent to receiving a bounty of 250 million berries, Jinbei was sent an invitation to join a government-sanctioned privateering system called the Seven Warlords of the Sea. In exchange for ceasing their persecution of 7 extremely powerful pirates and turning a blind eye to some of their ongoing crimes, typically against other pirates, they sacrifice a degree of autonomy and enter into the service of the world government. In chapter 624, Jinbei explicitly states that if he accepts the position within the world government as one of the 7 warlords, he can protect the fishmen who never wanted to become pirates in an effort to escape slavery permitted by the world government so that they could finally stop being fugitives. Once again, forcing a powerful yet tyrannized minority to enter into subservience in a noble act of self-sacrifice, the story invites the audience to sympathize with the oppressed in their struggle and to cry the world government for bargaining with the lives of innocents to dominate them. Jinbei, however, is also motivated by the constructively positive aspiration of bringing fishmen even closer to the world government, a sentiment seemingly shared by the humans that make up the highest authority of the world government, the 5 elders. Figure 11 shows that they also valued the symbolic reification of fishman-human relations in Jinbei's recruitment. Despite this, in chapter 1018, a former government agent called Who's Who derogatorily insults Jinbei's race while battling him. Jinbei responds in disdain.
I don't believe it. Don't you know, casual racism against fishmen is out of style these days. It's all about that competitive racism.
Can I use that?
So whilst the government's preeminent authority has outwardly expressed desire for peace and understanding, they have actually fostered an internal environment of intolerance and discrimination. This juxtaposition is embodied by employees like Who's who appear to undermine the leadership's concerns in Figure 11, but are actually perpetrating the institutionalized agenda against non-humans for the benefit of the world government. It shows that their desire to improve interracial relations is only skin deep, that in reality, they don't care. Positioning the world government antagonistically against Jinbei, a heroic protagonist, encourages the audience to associate the blatant racism directed against him with the government's authority. Jinbei's defeat of Who's Who could also be considered a symbolic victory over racism, not only showing that tolerance and diversity is stronger than racism, but that it is morally good and racism is morally bad.
In this chapter, I have surmised that as a human-run and human-centric institution, the world government view all non-humans as subhuman. Their ingrained prejudice causes them to ascribe a hierarchy of worth against non-humans, which leads to differential treatment of various individuals and races. To those they see coexisting with humans, they impose their own assumptions of a power dynamic of domination and subservience, stripping them of their personhood and labelling them as weak and worthless pets. This portrayal is in turn disseminated across and adopted by the populaces to whom the world government acts as the paramount authority, with little consideration to how the negative consequences of this will affect them personally or socially. For those they deem valuable or desirable for their strength, they endanger by seeking to possess and control through deception, manipulation, and coercion.
This racial hierarchy is so internalized within the world government that even internal efforts to challenge this harmfully prejudiced worldview by the leaders of the organization are subverted by its institutional racism, coming across as disingenuous. Through this framing, this systemic racism is judged to be wrong and harmful, its perpetrators cruel and immoral, and victims sympathetic and good.
There are many instances where the tyrannical world government systematically discriminates against ethnic minorities in One Piece. This chapter examines how the authoritarian regime targets oppressed minority groups, using one known as the D-Clan as a case study. It reveals that the world government's leadership-driven discrimination manifests as a hierarchy of oppression, predominantly seeking to control the people of the D through co-option, and failing that, dehumanizing them through criminalization. Their identity is censored if they become too notorious, and fear of persecution also compels the oppressed to conceal their own identities. This discrimination is presented negatively to the audience, both as immoral instruments of racist antagonists and an unjust source of danger for the protagonists.
The Will of D, or the D-Clan, is a group of important characters whose names share the middle initial D. Whilst their connection remains an underlying mystery of the series, and the only other shared trait seems to be an intense antagonism towards the world government and its leadership, I interpret them to be an ethnic group and treat them as such throughout this dissertation. One of the main ways the world government discriminates against the D-clan is through censoring their identity and compelling them to conceal themselves. The earliest and most notable instance of this is of the world government's greatest adversary, the late king of the pirates, Gold Roger. First hinted at by the long-lived Dr. Kureya at the end of the Drum Island arc in episode 91, it is inferred that before his name was misconstrued, he was originally Gold D. Roger. In the anime, the conversation goes,
Have you ever heard of the man Gold D. Roger?
Goldie? Do you mean Gold Roger?
I guess. Is that what he goes by now? From the looks of this, Monkey D. Luffy is no ordinary pirate. The spirit of D. It still lives.
A flashback sequence during the Paramount War arc reveals that whilst he was still alive, Roger himself believed this misnomer, visible on his wanted poster in Figure 12, was mistakenly spread by the world government's incompetence. In episode 485, he said,
Those world government clowns don't know what they're doing. Do you know what they've been calling me these days? They called me Gold Roger. My real name is Gold D. Roger.
The subtle connection between the late Pirate King and the main protagonist, Monkey D. Luffy, arouses suspicion that there is a deeper significance to the middle initial D than was previously let on. But with that, the tenuous connection between the two is solidified. It confirms, moreover, that it was indeed the world government who spread this misnomer. To what extent this blunder was accidental is dubious. This suspicion is deepened when the audience is privy to a secret discussion among the Five Elders, the ultimate authority of the world government. Their leadership is comprised entirely of world nobles, aka celestial dragons, a race of humans descended from a line of royal families who established the world government. In addition to being afforded its protection, their divine status makes it a crime to disobey or harm them under penalty of death. In Figure 13, they recount how much Luffy has been in the news, and they are concerned that the name D has become much too well known in recent years. Later, after Luffy has risen to even greater infamy, the depth of their consternation is unveiled. Upon witnessing Luffy's new wanted poster, an elder angrily reprimands the Marine who made it for not omitting the D as he ordered, frantically attempting to stop the presses and not let them go out into the world. These events, glimpsed by the audience, prove that the celestial dragons running the world government hold a secret agenda, compelling them to conceal the existence of the D-clan, particularly members of extreme notoriety like Gold D. Roger and Monkey D. Luffy. In addition to external censorship from the government, some members of the D-clan internally conceal their identities as a precaution for fear of persecution of their race. In a flashback from the Dressrosa arc, the captain of the Heart Pirates reveals that his true name is Trafalgar D. Waterloo, a family name kept secret for generations. This prompts Don Quixote Rocinante, a former celestial dragon, to impress upon Law the need to distance himself as much as possible from other world nobles, lest they discover his real name. Rocinante then goes on to explain in Figure 14 how the world nobles are taught to fear the people of the D as children. Labelled as harbingers of chaos and destruction, they are even called the enemies of the gods in chapter 764, the gods in question being the divine celestial dragons. Rocinante's testimony reveals that as both world nobles and leaders of the world government, the Five Elders possess the impetus and capacity to directly exert their prejudice against the D-clan using the full might of the institution. It proves an endemic culture of discrimination against the D-clan is ingrained into the upper echelons of the world government and a core function of the institution. The D-clan are doubtlessly aware of this to some degree, as apparent by Law's predecessors concealing their Ds. This means their founded fear of discovery and persecution, in tandem with the world government's persecution itself, are both internally and externally driving the D-clan out of existence. The second prong of the government's systemic discrimination toolset against minorities is dehumanization through criminalization. Of all the Ds introduced to the series, the majority come into conflict with the world government and are branded as criminals. This results in bounties being placed on their heads and their vilification in the eyes of the masses, to whom the world government acts as a benevolent protector. The abundance of wanted posters featuring various people of the D, as seen in Figure 15, supports this. However, such blatant and publicly broadcasted acts of castigation seem to undermine the aims of the previously established censorship, suggesting that a secondary, more nuanced motive guides the institution's behaviour. Examining the practice of creating wanted posters and setting bounties reveals that the world government uses its authority to strip the D-clan of their rights to protection and encourage their persecution by others. They effectively dehumanise them through criminalisation, with the ultimate goal of either killing them dead or capturing them alive. After the protagonist Luffy receives his first wanted poster in Figure 16, he gleefully exclaims to his crewmates,
"Alright guys, we're wanted criminals."
Soberingly, Navigator Nami retorts,
"Yet again, you guys don't understand how grim our situation really is. This means all of our lives will be in constant danger."
This exchange shows that the more sensible crewmates realise that being lumped together with other criminals on the high seas makes them easier targets for marginalisation and persecution. And, from an increased pool of adversaries no less, now the world government has issued an open invitation to hunt them down. When the leaders of these brigands, Blackbeard, calls out to the Straw Hats to tell them to give up, he threatens Luffy, saying he's going to take that 100 million berry head of his. The vulnerability thrust onto the Straw Hat crew here demonstrates how the world government successfully others the D-Clan, reinforcing that its leadership commandeers the institution to advance their own racially motivated agenda of discrimination. There are two reasons why the world government intentionally increased Monkey D. Luffy's notoriety when he first started out, only to backpedal later on, and try and conceal the D in his name. Firstly, the upper echelons of the government, the Five Elders, don't oversee the issuance of new bounties, and so left it to Navy headquarters in episode 45. Because they don't share the prejudice against the D-Clan with the world nobles, headquarters didn't care to omit his name, showing the discrimination is top-driven.
Secondly, once Luffy's infamy grew, the Five Elders consciously continued to permit the circulation of undoctored wanted posters because they didn't foresee him becoming such a strong opponent in the future.
One of the Five Elders is seen saying they can't afford to ignore this Monkey D. Luffy fellow in Figure 17, so they increase his bounty to 100 million berries and instigate ambitious actors like Blackbeard to deal with him on their behalf. This decision unintentionally backfires as it propels Luffy to even greater notoriety, but it displays that the world government will outlaw members of the D-Clan to try and dispose of them. If this method doesn't work and they become untouchable, then they try to censor the D in their names. The third and final method the world government employs to deal with the D-Clan is control. There are several documented cases where members of the D-Clan are co-opted into the world government whilst still retaining their Ds. One of the most notorious is the previously mentioned Blackbeard, aka Marshal D. Teach. Following a power vacuum created by the Straw Hats' defeat of one of the 7 warlords of the sea, a government-sanctioned privateer, one of Blackbeard's crewmates proposes him for the position. As previously established, the Navy's top brass undertaking the replacement don't possess any stigma against the will of D. However, from a position directly subservient to the Celestial Dragons, they, and by extension the Five Elders, allow him to join, and for a time assume a degree of control over Teach. Another example is the great hero of the Navy and Luffy's grandfather, Monkey D. Garp. With his immense physical strength and fighting prowess, Garp served in the Navy under the world government for over 50 years, rising to the rank of Vice Admiral and garnering world-renowned fame. These two high-profile cases reveal that the world government tolerate and even eagerly receive the D-Clan, criminal background or not, when they relinquish a portion of their autonomy and enter into a role of subservience under their sphere of influence. This raises the question, what happens when the world government is unable to exert control over members of the D-Clan, and how does this relate to their agenda of criminalisation and concealment? It's revealed in Figure 18 that Garp has repeatedly turned down the promotion to an admiral's position because it would place him directly beneath the Celestial Dragon's command, something his moral compass couldn't permit. Whilst the anime states that Garp would have been dismissed for his insubordination, the manga paints a harsher tone, stating that it is only his accomplishments and stature that keep him from being eliminated. This is no empty bluff either. Following Blackbeard's resignation from the warlords at Marineford during the Paramount War arc in episode 485, he received his first bounty of a staggering 2,247,600,000 berries, seen in Figure 15. This verifies that when the world government loses control of the D-clan, or cannot assume control over them in the first place, they resort to criminalization and censorship, be it in the form of a bounty or elimination. Therefore, when the world government isn't co-opting them into its ranks, it commits genocide against the D-clan, persecuting them when it can and erasing their identity when it cannot.
Through examining the various case studies at our disposal, I have concluded that the elite-driven persecution and discrimination against the D-clan minority group by the world government assumes a predictably methodical progression. The world government's chief desire is to control this minority by placing them in positions of subservience. Failing this, they have no qualms against criminalizing them and leaving them vulnerable to their portrayal to the masses as subhuman sea scum, with irresistible bounties on their heads, forcing some people of the D to conceal their true names by assuming aliases. And finally, when members of the D clan garner too much fame and become strong enough to pose a serious threat to the world government, they censor them, so as to conceal their problematic heritage from the general public. By framing the government and their systemically racist methods as antagonistic in the story, causing suffering to both antagonists and protagonists, their negative moral evaluation is intensified.
For nearly 25 years across multiple mediums, One Piece has garnered vast acclaim from followings both. For nearly 25 years of continuous publication across multiple mediums, One Piece has garnered vast acclaim from followings both domestic and international. As director Musashi Koizuka said in an interview for the new upcoming The One Piece Netflix anime, he believes this is because themes in the original manga are deep. Like war or race, it allows all ages of readers to ponder about it and be entertained at the same time. Despite this, there remains relatively little academic discourse surrounding what could be considered the Harry Potter of Japan. I aim to remedy this by analysing how One Piece's overarching anti-authoritarian sentiment translates to an anti-racism sentiment. Despite the controversy over skin whitening in its anime, I concluded that the discourse of One Piece is decidedly anti-racist through its identification, framing, and critique of institutional racism.
I arrived here by first asking how the main antagonistic force of One Piece, the tyrannical government, perceives minorities, and how this manifests in their behaviour towards them. In my multimodal critical discourse and framing analysis of desirable and undesirable non-humans, I found that as an institution, the hegemonic world government is prejudiced against non-human minorities. It strives to dominate those it perceives as useful and jeopardizes them for its benefit. Those it considers useless, it endangers and devalues by dehumanization. Its leadership attests to wanting interracial peace and understanding, but do nothing to address the underlying cause, whether due to incompetence or disingenuity. This defines the problem of racism as a systemic one. It also defines the totalitarian government of One Piece as the perpetrator of systemic racism, and non-humans as their victims. This resonates with Da Silva Calixto-Woodall's analysis of One Piece's story arcs that explicitly critique racism, as they also concluded that bodies outside of the norm were strongly discriminated against by the state. I further built on this by identifying how the series frames differential discrimination. This is significant because it shows that One Piece is as implicitly anti-racist and anti-authoritarian throughout the whole series as it is when it explicitly discusses themes of racism and discrimination. Whilst I wasn't surprised to find consistency in One Piece's framing of racism, reflective of real life's nuance, discovering differential discrimination implicitly represented by the series was unexpected because the show doesn't discuss this explicitly. My second research question aimed to discern how and why One Piece's tyrannical governmental authority interacts with problematic racial minorities. In my chapter about manifestations of the world government's discrimination against the D-clan, I defined the nature of One Piece's systemic racism. I showed that the world government methodically persecutes minorities by first aiming to control them, then, failing this, criminalizing them and censoring or making them hide their names as a final resort. The other frame utilized here also diagnoses the root cause of One Piece's systemic racism. this genocide is driven by the institution's leaders and perpetuated by the institutionalized racism they have fostered within it, reflecting how their racist ideologies were instilled in them through their upbringings. This elaborates upon Da Silva Calixto's argument that racism was a key tool of the state for maintaining power, as it identifies the specific ways the world government used racism to maintain power. This is significant because it highlights precisely what practices are used to demonstrate the series' underlying message to the audience that systemic racism is bad. I was astonished to find that such a formulaic strategy was being employed throughout the series to frame the antagonists as villains, because I didn't recognise this when I first watched the series. It does align with the author Oda's established anti-authoritarian sentiment though. Finally, to lend significance to my analysis and draw out my normative stance, I sought to find how Oda may influence the audience's perception of discrimination and systemic racism in his representation of characters, scenes, and story. My first analysis chapter on differential discrimination surmised that the way institutional racism negatively affects protagonists and antagonists alike seeks to evoke sympathy and indignation in the audience. It invites them to reprise the injustice of racists and their harmful mentalities, painting them as evil, ignoble, and wrong. It also encourages the audience to support and respect the victims and adversaries of racism, presenting their mentality and conduct as good, just, and right. The second analysis chapter about manifestations of discrimination established that through his work, Oda seeks to convey that the practices, tools, and tactics that racists and their institutions use to oppress minorities, specifically control, criminalization, and censorship, are reprehensible. By associating these actions with institutional racism, he urges the audience to denounce them as fundamentally unjust. This is important because it means that the implicit moral evaluation of this acclaimed series is consistent with its explicit portrayal of systemic racism. This implies that the anime's skin whitening incident, used as a straw man in the introduction, was disconnected from the series' anti-racist message because it is antithetical to the comprehensive framing of the show. I didn't anticipate the fact that members of the world government were also victims of its institutional racism. It wasn't something I registered on my first viewing, but my methodology helped enunciate it more clearly by giving more salience to seemingly unimportant aspects of the series. It provides another clear example of One Piece's racial commentary being as nuanced as the real world it draws its inspiration from.
Through answering my research questions, this dissertation explores the implicit messages conveyed through popular anime and manga, which may influence public understanding of racism. It suggests that popular media should be analysed more deeply, regardless of how mainstream or explicit it appears to be. Even without a clear catalyst, such as One Piece's skin whitening, which undermines and conflicts with the series' underlying message, it is prudent to examine whether what media says aligns with what it does. It also fills the dearth of academic analysis on One Piece, and builds on the existing body of literature on analysing racism in media with the relatively peripheral subject of anime, but does have its limits. Because scholars could be guided by different knowledge frameworks, they may interpret texts differently to me. This warrants further research, including but not limited to qualitative interviews of focus groups, to uncover how samples of audience members interpret the series and its influence on public discourse. Guided by Edmund's framing methodology, how the series frames treatment recommendations and suggests remedies for overcoming systemic racism would also benefit from audience-based qualitative research. Nonetheless, if there's one takeaway from this, let it be that One Piece's stance on racism is anything but skin deep. Okay. With my One Thesis drawing to a close, I'd like to thank the people who helped shape my dissertation, starting with my dissertation advisor Martin Scott for his unwavering support and guidance, Tasha Hill, whose work inspired this dissertation in both form and focus, and Daigo Kawauchi Ortega for his boundless enthusiasm and encyclopedic knowledge of One Piece. I'd also like to thank everyone who helped make this video possible, beginning with UEA's Department of Global Development, for the professional skills workshops which gave me the tools to bring this project to life, Benjamin Chesterton from Duck Rabbit for showing me how fun and simple mobile filmmaking can be, Mum, Dad, Jeannie, Ben, Luke, Alex, Daigo and Josh
for their fantastic voice acting and camera work. My dog Merlin, who played a larger role in this than I originally anticipated, and for being a very good boy. Soph, Welch, and Easy for dramatically changing my hair. Twice. Mike Pixley from Bonsai Pot for planting the seed of an idea to turn this into a video essay. Kate and Morrill for editing and translation advice. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.